this. Now turn your Bibles over to Colossians 2, verse 16. And this passage, I believe, falls at a very interesting point in our current status right now as Grace Bible Church, with a church council meeting coming up, with a board meeting coming up, with and it feels like 18 years coming up. I want us to see how this passage actually frees us from worrying about whether or not things are normal. This passage frees us from thinking that we are so tied to tradition that if we don't get to do something, that things are worse because of it. Colossians 2, 16 through 23 address some areas that are kind of foreign to a lot of our minds. American Christianity is generally not marked by a lot of religious festivals and a lot of fasting and spiritual disciplines, but these are addressed here. And as we've been working through this series on Colossians, the concept that I've wanted you guys to have is, what are you filling your minds with? We know that as athletes, if an athlete eats only Cheetos and Doritos and donuts, that they'll have a really good time with what they eat, but their performance is going to be terrible. If they fuel themselves with good food, they're going to do better. Now, I do know that some linemen in different colleges and professional programs would eat buckets of fried chicken before the game. I heard one guy eating bones and all. I was very jealous of that person, that they get fried chicken every week. But I know there are some exceptions. But think about, what are you filling your minds with? And today, we're going to talk about symbols and how it was introduced last week with baptism. And I want to work this week a little bit more on the ideas of how is our calendar filled with symbols, and maybe even some symbols that we don't even recognize are part of our life. When I was in seminary, we had to read this really big book on how when you're leading, recognize that there's symbolic items inside of every organization and every structure that people might not even recognize are symbols that have deep meaning until you try to change them or get rid of them or no longer do them. Think about just how decorations inside of a building. In some churches, if you were to move a picture that was donated by Bob Smith, the family of Bob Smith might leave that church because that picture was moved. And you would have thought, what does this picture of a pile of roses even stand for? And it symbolized to maybe that family, their connection and devotion to that church. So I want you to think broader whenever you think about symbols and really ask yourself, what are maybe the markers of Christianity that we say a Christian is fill in the blank? And I want to ask, is that what necessarily should be our markers? So read along with me Colossians 2, 16 through 23. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. Do not let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualify you. For such a person also goes into great detail about what they have seen, and they are puffed up with idle notions by their unspiritual mind. They have lost connection with the head, from whom the whole body, supported and held together by its ligaments and sinews, grows as God causes it to grow. Since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you still belonged to the world, do you submit to the rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. These rules, which have to do with things that are all destined to perish with use, are based on merely human commands and teaching. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom, with their self-imposed worship and their false humility and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. You probably have an idea now of what I was talking about with rules, regulations, and symbols as we entered into this. But I want to first off say, fill your mind with Jesus over symbols. And when you fill your mind with Jesus, He then can create things that have little to no meaning be meaningful and symbolic in your life. I think about how whenever we have these Bibles, which in America are so common, so prevalent. I think there's probably at least 10 different versions used right now by the people in this room. And if you were to have my Bible in your hands, you might think, oh, that's kind of neat. It's Pastor Ben's Bible. But if your great-grandfather's Bible were to be given to you, there'd be meaning. It's the Bible of the faith of your family. Especially maybe if your grandfather or great-grandfather was the first person to be saved in your family. It would have a lot more meaning. And so that book, which is really paper and print, took on meaning with the content, with it being a Bible, and even further value with the life of the person who owned it. But you need to fill your minds with Jesus, and He then can make sense of all that goes on. So it starts off saying, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink. Now, this is kind of a marking point of what Christianity was, at least up until the 1990s. Whenever someone asked, who is a conservative or who is an evangelical Christian, it was typically marked by they don't drink alcohol and they don't use tobacco products and they try not to swear and they don't dance and they don't wear skirts above their knees, and they don't wear shirts without sleeves. These were the marks of conservative Christians up for a long point inside of Christianity. And now we still see kind of the semblance of judging someone by what you eat or drink. And I want to just point out for here and for right now, as Christians, we can create false standards. Standards that are not in the Bible. We can create a reality of what it means to be a Christian, and we can judge people harshly by it based on what these people do or do not do. And I've mentioned it before when we went through Ephesians, and I'm mentioning it now. Someone can be a Christian and still smoke tobacco or other items and still be a Christian if they drink alcohol. Now, this seems surprising to some. To many, it's not. But think about the counter with that. Why are these markings that we have as Christians? Why is it that we might have pride if we've never consumed something that someone else has consumed? I've heard people boast about things that they haven't done. And it's always interesting. Everyone can boast about something that they haven't done. But what I want people to think about is what Christ has done. Oftentimes the conversation that we have in regards to I'm free to do this or I'm choosing not to do this, it doesn't center around Jesus Christ. It centers around maybe what we've been taught. And so if people want to have the big biblical conversation about alcohol, I'll have it with them. Someone wants to have a big biblical conversation about other items, I'll have it with them. But this says, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink. This is probably also mostly referring to whether or not someone is having a fast on specific days of the year or not. If you remember when we went through Leviticus, there was festivals, there was weeks, there was these times whenever you weren't allowed to have any wheat, you weren't allowed to have any alcohol. You were supposed to live in a little tent or a hut, remembering the time of the wilderness wandering, the festival of booths. And this, starting off right here, is addressing, first and foremost, whether or not people are trying to still live out the Jewish religious calendar and judge people whether or not someone is following the Jewish religious calendar and food aversions and regulations. So do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. I want you to look at that picture of these were a shadow of things to come. Whenever we celebrate Advent, whenever we celebrate Lent, we typically remove items from our life, trying to make us have a better focus upon a goal or an item, a better focus upon the truth of Jesus. Does not eating meat and having less sugar during Lent make you a better Christian? I would submit that for some of you it makes you a worse Christian because your blood sugar gets low and you say things out of anger because you need to just eat. But it can make someone a better Christian if they are not trusting in the fast in of itself to bring them closer to Christ. And this is what the do not eat, do not drink, or the festivals needs to be about. I just mentioned prior to this that we are going to have communion on this upcoming Sunday. We're going to have a plastic cup with some grape juice in it, with cellophane over that, with a thin, we're going to call it a wafer on top of that, with some more cellophane on top of it. It's going to be hard to unwrap, it's going to feel weird, and it's going to feel foreign. It's going to be very different from the first Lord's Supper, where they had three cups of wine, and they had bread and bitter herbs, and they were sitting around a table, and they were remembering the Passover. It's going to look different. It's going to feel different. Some churches celebrate communion every week. Some churches look down on others that don't, and some say we just want to do it as often as we can. The frequency that you do something that is symbolic is not as important as to why are you doing it. So, I'm going to just introduce something for you to think about. Why, for those of you who do not smoke, why don't you smoke? And what do you think about those that do? Why, for those of you who don't chew tobacco, do you not chew tobacco? And what do you think about those that do? Why, for those of you who do not use marijuana or other recreational drugs, do you not use them? And what do you think about those that do? Why, for those of you that don't drink alcohol, do you not drink alcohol? And what do you think about those that do? See, this is where oftentimes I want us to say our thinking about those items, we can categorize here, but it's sort of the exact same boat in this passage as why, for those of you that do communion every week, do you do it every week? And what do you think about those that don't? This idea of eating or drinking or not eating or not drinking or celebrating or not celebrating, this concept needs to be centered around Jesus Christ. And are you filling your mind with Him? Because it goes on to say, do not let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualify you. For such a person goes into great detail about what they've seen, and they are puffed up and with idle notions by their unspiritual mind. They have lost connection with the head, from whom the whole body, supported and held together by its ligaments and sinews, grows as God causes it to grow. So, as Christians, we listen to the radio, we watch a preacher on TV, we read a book, we get the magazines, we have the conversations, and we try to learn how to be a better Christian. I mean, if you haven't asked, how do I become a better Christian, then you're fooling yourself. It needs to be a question that we ask. But oftentimes, the sources that we hear, they can become very muddled and sometimes actually be false voices. A few years back, there was a series of, not a series because that implies they're in sequence, a group of books all coming out about how people had seen heaven and they wanted to tell you all about it. And that was supposed to make you worship Jesus better and be a better Christian because this person had a vision or an experience of heaven. Paul in the book of Corinthians and right here is saying if that person is trying to make their experience be your norm or your regular or your means by which you judge your relationship with God, don't listen to this person. And I know a lot of people who are like, I just wish I had this greater experience of Christ. And so then they'll want to walk through, are you fasting? Are you doing this? Are you trying to have visions? Are you meditating? Are you doing all these other items? Things which in of themselves are not bad. But you cannot work your way by celebrating festivals or not doing or doing things into having a better relationship and growing more like Jesus. Now this seems weird because we are supposed to be active in our faith. We're supposed to be growing every day. We're supposed to be working our faith out with fear and trembling. So how is it that we're supposed to be working our faith out, yet at the same time, nothing we do makes us more like Jesus? Does anyone else find that a very odd paradox of Christianity? Does anyone else get frustrated by that? I wish there was a formula. I wish Paul, it says work out. All right, I'm going to do 10 push-ups. I'm going to be more like Jesus. For those of you who are attuned to that. But look, Jesus Christ is the head, and he holds everything together, and God causes people to grow more like him through him. One of the biggest areas that causes us not to grow is the pride of thinking that what we're doing or not doing is what's going to make us grow. Reading the Bible is a blessed, good action. But some of the most prideful people I've seen in the last 10 years have read the Bible 100 times more than me. So just the action of reading the Bible doesn't make you more like Jesus. Going to church every single Sunday doesn't make you more like Jesus. But in the pursuit of Jesus, should you read his word? Should you read it as much as you can? Should you fellowship with his people and gather and worship the resurrection as often as you can? But do you guys see the difference in those two items? It's kind of a horse and a cart type argument. Jesus has to be pulling the reasoning and everything else. And as a reminder here, we need to fill ourselves, this is going to sound odd, with the death of Jesus. Fill your minds with the death of Jesus. Whenever you have an argument or a fight with someone, have you ever stopped and said, Jesus died because I just argued with someone? My anger and disgust towards someone, which is a deed of the flesh, was enough to put Jesus on the cross. We often like to think about the sum of our sinfulness being the reason why Jesus died. Sin actions, That's why Jesus died. So just because it's a sin that you didn't think was that bad or that destructive doesn't mean it wasn't directly linked to the death of Jesus Christ. Since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you still belonged to the world, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not touch, do not taste. These are rules which have to do with things that are all destined to perish. But, it says, all these indeed have an appearance of wisdom with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. I'm going to submit to each of you that if you have said, I'm not going to drink alcohol for fill-in-the-blank reason, don't drink alcohol for fill-in-the-blank reason. If you've said, I'm not going to smoke cigarettes for fill-in-the-blank reason, don't smoke cigarettes for fill-in-the-blank reason. If you've said you're going to become a vegan or a vegetarian for fill-in-the-blank reason, follow through that. I don't really care. But don't believe that those treatments of your body are a one-to-one correlation and causation of you being able to live a better life. You see, one of the very dangerous aspects of pride is that we often don't realize how prideful we are, and it's actually in our thoughts of how humble we are by how we live that it can show how prideful we really are. You know, it's odd. Like this is, in my mind, I can see 100 applications for our daily life. I always follow the traffic rules, unlike that idiot over there who simply just wants chaos to fall upon this area and just wants people to die. You know, I always buy organic, local, meaning that I just want this community to be better than that person who buys from Walmart, who just couldn't care less and just isn't a contributor to our society. You know, you think about, like, whenever we have an idea of humility, it takes someone else kind of poking fun at what we find humility in to realize that it's really pride. You know, I'm not a sociologist, so I don't have the expert training to watch different groups and how they talk about themselves, but I've experienced everywhere I've lived people ragging hard time on where they live, saying, man, you know, we're just small town hicks and hillbillies. I've heard that in people in towns of less than 1,000 to cities of over 50,000. People in Kalamazoo, Michigan, small town. It's not a small town. I've heard people in every area of Chicago rag on their taxes, their this, their that. But do you know what also happens with the same people who rag on their hillbilliness to their cityness? Don't mess with me about where I'm from. Woo! You talk bad about fill in the blank where the person's born, you don't know what's coming to you. You know, it's interesting. There's this false humility about where they live and how they're great because of it. You know, I once heard it explained to me that when you look at Astoria, Vermont, Ipava, and Table Grove, there's different levels of who's intelligent and who's attractive depending on which city. I'll let you sort that out. You know, everybody knows that you cheer for the winners, not the losers. Or, hey, you know, I'm a Cubs fan. I rooted for a loser for 100 years. I'm obviously a supportive sports fan. Or if you root for the Cowboys, who are never going to win another playoff game as long as Jerry Jones is alive, if they can survive that. You're a good fan. You're faithful. Like, we find all these ways that we want to make ourselves be obviously better, but if we were to tell people that we're better because of it, then it would be pride. So we want, like, there's this thing called humble brag. Like, if you aren't aware of what a humble brag is, maybe it's because you're not on Facebook or social media. But these are just the little things, the little ways that we try to boost our self-esteem or make other people notice us. But none of that is rooted in the death of Jesus or filling our minds with Jesus. And that's what Paul is trying to get at, because everything else has an air of false humility. And there's things that can be genuinely 100% good and great. Like, are you attending church? Are you reading the Bible? Are you fasting? Are you praying? Are you taking communion? Are you baptized? To things that really don't matter, such as, I always wear whatever. My shirt is always tucked in polite conversation. Or I wear black at a funeral, unlike those people who are now wearing maroon. It's not acceptable. We really have to ask ourselves these questions. And this is where it moves into Colossians 3 with what we're supposed to tear off, declothe ourselves with, things that are directly connected to the flesh versus what we're supposed to put on in relationship to Jesus. Think about this. When you heard that Osama bin Laden was killed, what was your heart response? And then what did you think about people who acted the other way? Now that's a very complicated question that takes a lot to unwork, but I knew people who were just like, that's someone who died. That's someone who's in hell. How could you celebrate that? There's almost a pride in the fact that they mourned over the death of Osama bin Laden when other people were celebrating it. And these just little conversations, though, about asking yourself, are you trying to make yourself look like you worship Jesus better than someone else? Or are you actually saying, I'm going to worship you, Jesus. I'm going to throw away the rules and the regulations. It's some of the most pagan people in the world go to church every single time the doors are open. And I'm not accusing anyone right now of that, but that's a reality. That attendance in church is not a one-to-one correlation with following Jesus. Just as if someone misses church, it does not mean that they don't love Jesus anymore. As we approach communion next week, I want it to be about what it actually is about, which is celebrating the death of Christ, filling our minds and our hearts with the reality that our sin and the sinfulness of our world caused God to be so broken that he decided to take on human flesh and walk this world. And that he died, and that his very blood and his very body had to be broken for there to be any hope of reconciliation. So it doesn't matter next week if it's juice instead of wine, or if it's, 1/8 of an ounce and not 1/4 of an ounce. It doesn't matter if we're not dipping it in or not dipping it in. It doesn't matter if the wafer is actually styrofoam. Sorry, it's been an issue of mine for like 26 years that in churches we celebrate Jesus' body by some synthetic petroleum byproduct. Go green and make real bread whenever the pandemic's over, and let's just rip into it. But just even that, let's make next week about Jesus. Let's have our church council meeting be about how can we serve Jesus wisely and lovingly. How can we use our budget for Jesus? how can we follow the one who died for us in the same manner? Let's pray.